Hello, I'm Robert. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Surviving Addictions about my recovery from alcoholism and drug addiction. I'm now about to make a recording of my experience and how 40 years ago I was led to a program that would help me stop drinking and stay stopped and stop using drugs as well. And I can assure anyone listening that on that day, on the 29th of July 1985, if someone had said to me, "You'll never have take alcohol or take drugs again," I wouldn't have believed it possible because for 5 years I'd been trying to quit and I couldn't do it. I'd manipulated a doctor and two psychiatrists into giving me a huge amount of tranquilizers and sleeping pills, which I was taking every day. And I was drinking between 3 and 5 bottles of wine a day by that time, as well as topping it up with spirits and beer and whatever else I could get my hands on. Life by then was a complete mess. Uh, when I was 35, I persuaded a doctor's daughter, a friend of mine that I used to smoke cannabis with, to go with me to Venice. And the whole idea was that her being a doctor's daughter, it would help me stop drinking. Well, needless to say, it didn't work. My heart wasn't in it. The first night we arrived, I persuaded her to come with me to Harry's Bar, a well-known establishment in Venice, and I proceeded to get absolutely drunk, completely out of my mind. The next morning, she was furious with me. I had a terrible hangover. Um, she wanted to go and see churches and art galleries and things like that. And I just tagged along, feeling terrible about myself and what had happened and how I'd let her down, but most of all, how I'd let myself down. And I knew that once that had happened, the rest of the time we were going to spend there, the few nights, it was going to be a disaster. I was going to get drunk all the time, and I'd make no progress whatsoever. But an extraordinary thing did actually happen. I think it was around 12 o'clock, we'd got to a church, and I had no idea anything because to me it was just another church. There's so many in Venice. And she said she'd had enough. We were having an argument about something, about my drinking, and so she left me, and that was it. I sat on the steps of the church and I cried my eyes out. I didn't stop for a long time, and I've just never been so ashamed and so beaten. I was terrified. I knew that I'd got to the jumping off point, that the likelihood was that I was going to die, and that was going to be relatively soon. I was terrified of dying, and so on. Anyway, we went back to London, and I was by very shortly after that, I started to see a psychiatrist called Max Glatt, who was very well known for helping alcoholics get well. And it didn't work because I never told him what was going on. I lied all the time, which was part of my life at that by that point. Um, and um, and so he basically gave up with me and said, "Look, there's another psychiatrist who might be able to help you. His name is Paddy O'Connor. He looks after addiction and alcoholism in the RAF. Would you be prepared to see him?" So I did, and Paddy introduced me to a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and he was sober. I met him in his car, but I wasn't in the slightest bit interested in listening to him and his suggestions. So I left, and I just carried on as usual, drinking and so on. I liked Paddy very much, and I saw him regularly every week for probably about 2 years, and all the time he never gave up with me. I mean, obviously I had an insurance company paying for these visits, but he and I got on really well. He was a terribly kind man. But what had happened was that by now I'd got it, as well as drinking all this alcohol every day, 3 to 5 bottles of wine, and the other stuff, I was up to between 150 and 250 milligrams of Valium a day, plus between 3 and 5 sleeping pills every night. And the reason that the amounts varied was that on Sundays, for some extraordinary reason, I would go without alcohol completely, but I would just fill myself up with more Valium and take, the 5 sleeping pills at night to make sure I slept. And of course, by then, having done this every day for 20 years and drunk alcohol almost every day for 25 years, my tolerance was incredible. So the amount that I was taking, it would have literally killed a horse or an elephant. But to me, I could just take it all. It wasn't a problem. It was actually quite amusing on one occasion. Um, Paddy said to me at one of the sort of ending sessions, he said, well, he said, I can't think of anything else. He said, but if you met the right woman and got married, you know, maybe you'd quit. I can assure you, marriage was very unlikely. I was coming up to 40. Women in my life were not the sort to marry, even in my drunken stupor. They were just women that tolerated me even when I was drunk. And of course, a lot of them drank quite a lot as well. But most of the time I was on my own. I was looking pretty respectable to, from the outside because I'd made quite a bit of money in rather dubious ways. Um, and So I had various properties. I had one on Putney Hill, one at Marble Arch, a place called Bryanston Court, which was very prestigious. Um, I lived in Mayfair, and I had another flat in Wigmore Street by Selfridges. So it all looked pretty good on the outside, except that I knew about all the arrests and the diseases that I was getting from living the way that I was living. I knew about the fact that I'd lost my job, that I was drunk by lunchtime every day. I knew all this, but nobody else did. At least I thought nobody else did. And also about the hospitalizations. I had 5 or 6 hospitalizations in those 5 years after the Venice trip. Um, I just didn't think I'd ever be able to stop. Anyway, extraordinarily, I met a lovely woman and she married me. I couldn't believe it. She wanted to get married as much as I wanted to stop drinking, which was 100%. But needless to say, married, I didn't stop. I carried on. The marriage, after a few months, she realized that I was a complete disaster. And she said, if you don't stop, you're out, and that's it. And I can assure you, was guaranteed the way things were going. And so I went into a treatment center, and in a treatment center, the one I was in anyway, um, they detoxed the patients, and because of what I was coming off, the amount of drugs as well as the alcohol, I mean, it's always difficult. Um, but given the amount of Valium and sleeping pills, it was exceptionally difficult, and I had an epileptic fit. So I was in a coma after 3 days and literally at death's door. I mean, there was no question about it. And I was unconscious. And anyway, when I came around, I was being given oxygen. And one of the people there was a doctor. I won't mention his name, but he uh, he was 6 years sober, and he told me his story, and it was almost identical to mine. Quite amazing. He'd drunk in the same way, he'd used drugs in the same way, and but the difference was he was 6 years sober, and I wasn't. I was still on. They were giving me a small amount of tranquilizers just to wean me off, but I still had the epileptic fit because of the amount that I'd been on. Um, anyway, he told me what to do if I truly wanted to stop drinking and taking drugs, and how to do it. So I stayed there for 7.5 weeks, and I was amazed when they let me go because I thought I was the worst they'd got. I didn't understand what they were talking about, the counselors, and um, what I was very fortunate about was that the people with me, they were drug addicts as well, or alcoholics, but some of them were on heroin, cocaine, things that I hadn't taken, which meant they were criminalized, which was crazy. Why were they criminals and I wasn't? It just didn't make any sense, any of it. But anyway, I left there, and I'd been out of work for several years. My company had gone belly up, and my alcoholism meant that I was drunk by lunchtime every day, and I just couldn't work. So after a few months, I'd met some people who were helping me, and they were guiding me on how to stay sober. And these were the people that the doctor had put me in contact with. And after 6 months, one of them suggested um, that no, earlier on, when I was newly in recovery, one of them said to me, write on a piece of paper two things you'd like to have happen. And I wrote down work at London Zoo and become a stockbroker. And the person who told me this said, you put that on one side and you don't look at it again for a year. So after 6 months, this friend of mine who was helping me said to me, Robert, it's time you got a job. Now, I thought he was nuts, completely nuts. But I was playing a bit of bridge again. I used to play quite a lot of bridge, and I was playing a bit of game with some friends of mine. And a friend of theirs wife of a friend of theirs was playing. She was my partner, and she said to me, "What do you do for a living?" And I said, "I don't. I'm out of work. I'm looking for a job, but my hopes aren't too high, sort of thing." But she could tell from the way I played bridge that I was reasonably bright, not super bright, but bright enough. So she said, "Well, I'll have a word with my husband, and we'll fix you up. See if he'll fix you up." So he had a carpet business and a few other little things that he dabbled in. So he took me on. So I did that for 6 months, and I wasn't very good at it, I must admit. He was very tolerant and very kind. But I did it. I started at 8 in the morning, finished at 5 in the afternoon. I was always absolutely shattered by Friday evening. And but I was back with my wife and all the rest of it. And so this man who'd said this about doing that for 6 months, he said, "Well, Robert, it's maybe time to, you know, do something that would suit you better." And I was my father-in-law was a very successful entrepreneur, and he several times had tried to get me to work with one of his companies, and I didn't want to do that for obvious reasons, that the family thing and so on. And he sort of backed me against a wall one day, and he said, "Well, what do you really want to do?" And I said, "Well, all my life, all I've ever wanted to be was a stockbroker." And I did know quite a lot about it. Um, and so that was that. He said, "Well, I could help you get into Hambros if you wanted me to. I know the chief executive there." And I said, "No, thank you. I'll wait and see what happens." So I did. The following Saturday night, I was at a drinks party. I wasn't drinking. And lo and behold, there was a drunk there, a man who was very, very drunk, very well spoken and sort of very public school and all the rest of it. And he said to me, in his drunken state, "What do you do?" And I said, I'm working with this carpet firm." And he said, "Oh, right." And I said, "What do you do?" And he said, I run a stockbroking firm." And I said, "Oh, I've always wanted to be a stockbroker." Anyway, to cut a long story short, he gave me a job. He offered it to me on the spot, even though he was drunk, and said, "Come in on Monday." Anyway, it turned out that this firm were as dodgy as anything I'd ever come across in my life. And in fact, they got found out and were wound up very quickly. Not long after, but they had been going for several years, and it was quite a big story at the time. Anyway, I'm working there, And this friend who helped me in the early months of my recovery, by then he'd moved to New York. And I rang him up and I told him about this firm. And I said, I just don't know what to do. I can't go on working there. They're just crooks, you know. And I explained to him what they were doing. And he said, right, he said, I'll have a word with the managing director of a firm in London and I'll make sure you get an interview for a job. And that's what happened. Anyway, I'm going to stop this there. This is going to be episode one. I hope you've enjoyed it and you'll want to know much more about how I recovered and why I'm 40 years later, I'm still clean and sober and drug free, and life has always got better. Thank you.